Hi, this is Gretchen Vogel. My website is How Spirit Works. My Facebook page is Choices Publishing. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between authority and network. And this is getting into a little bit of not politics, but societal trends. And as you know, these meditations that I did, this channeling that I did back in the early 90s, this particular one was in the early 90s, was with a representational character or figurehead who was very reminiscent of Socrates. Now, whether it actually was Socrates or not, I don't think that matters. But let's hear what he has to say anyway. So we'll get started. You know, I was a very big thinker of my times, but my times were more limited than yours in many ways because of the technology of our times. We dealt much more with the written word and the spoken word, and very relatively short lifespans. Our lives were in much smaller in the sense of both time span and distance travel. So our world was much smaller than yours is. And yours is indeed a fascinating time in many ways, not as frightening as you might perceive them on the whole, for the lives of many people are much better than the lives of the ordinary citizen was in my day. It was only the elite, the established groupings of hierarchy, whether they were wealthy merchants or connected to the throne or scholars or musicians, that had reasonable sanitary conditions, medical attention, such as it was for our time and day. And so, on the whole, people on the earth were living in a very different circumstances. I had declared a purpose in coming to see this figurehead. My question was very species-oriented about the evolution of the human species at our point, was my question. What is the truth of action in our lives, was my question. Are we supposed to just go with the flow of events in our lives, submitting or accepting authority, bending to the will of others around us, or do we really direct and create our own reality? That was my question. He said, now, since being in his body, he's been sitting around thinking a lot. And he says, I'm actually in one of his spiritual houses. And I've continued to observe and ponder the state of human affairs on this planet, which he is very much tied to. The concept of authority and submitting to authority was much more culturally an imperative in his day. The organization of people was much more important to the actual function of cities as a group. In order to even meet the minimum of requirement of food, even as minimally as those requirements were met for the largest number of people, there had to be much more of an organizational running and controlling things, so to speak. I think I stopped the tape for some reason and then came back. I'm not sure why. It's interesting because Socrates was able to see the room that I was sitting in, and he said he's willing to actually come into my space with me. He resumes. And so the organization of certain people who oversaw the masses of people, it was really necessary to the organization of the social life in my times. Because the morality was not I'm trying to get this right, what he's saying. Evolved. The morality was not developed as much in the ordinary person as it is in modern man. At least not in the civilizations that were around the Mediterranean at the time. And so direct authority was much more necessary to organize the masses into functioning groups. And so in his culture, it was very much more submission to authority, and the supreme authority being the state or the government, the ruler of the time. And so people did not think in terms of creating their own life, or creating their own life in spite of the organization that was imposed over their life. And he says it's interesting that that period in the 60s, 1960s, when there was a real turning upside down of the concept that had lasted with the first organization of cities and societies was overturned in the 60s. And that had a lot to do with technology, because people became governing of themselves on a much more grassroots level. In other words, neighbor to neighbor. It wasn't as much the big brother idea, watching the individual in the 60s. It was the individual's own interaction in society that determined how they functioned in society. Now, this happened throughout technological connection, people to people, which made every person part of the structure of society instead of the structure of society. He's showing it as being over or above the individual or the everyday person. But through technology, interwove people or connected them all, just like the telephone lines that connect us all to each other. And therefore, the structure of society is woven into a web of the connection person to person. And so the superstructure of society has become less and less important, particularly in our country. It really doesn't matter in our country who's president, because even though the economy does respond to who is president, the personal economic response to the president is very direct. But the president doesn't have anything to do with the philosophical or the philosophical attitudes of individuals, your judicial system is much more of a structure over the structure of society. And in the 60s, this was realized, that every man was his own voice. There were blossoms of this at different times throughout civilizations. When particular geniuses were looking ahead in a time of the evolution of the human species orientation, in a future orientation, they could see that this was going to become a webwork of individual citizens. However, the technology of the day, when those geniuses lived, had not evolved to make this possible. They were just seeing this was going to be happening in the future. So although you will think of this idea as something that has just cropped up, it could not be enacted until the technology did truly interconnect us all as individuals at the level that each member is operating at. And remember, this was before the internet, when I was doing these meditations. So now you are living in a world. It's going back to religion. Your religious traditions of Christianity, Islam, Protestantism, even though the newer sects are not holding as the reins over the individual, but the older, more traditional religions certainly reflected the only mode or way that people were organized. And this was in the sense of dictating ideas or concepts or desirability of certain actions to people, and dictating this. Unfortunately, for the most part, the continuation of the institution of the church itself. And your educational system, you even see your educational system has acknowledged the student as the cell in the institutional body, giving the student more leeway and self-determination and activity within the institution. So the institution is dictating less to the student. So the institution is more responsive to the individual, particularly in your Western civilization. And so we see also the authority of religion and the churches receding because people have ceased to think that in following authority. Now, on a much more basic level, on a very intimate level, people's relationships to their concept of God is also changing with this restructuring or this grassroots networking, where the individual is autonomous and empowered, an empowered unit. And the individual is the individuals who are keeping abreast of the current species let us say, evolution, but evolution in consciousness. And when it comes to the God consciousness, the old authoritarian concept of punishing or the avenging God, or the God who judges, the God who decides what must be for an individual, the idea of pleasing a personified God is no longer valid, because, again, it is the melting of the superstructure that organized people into over the individuals. And this is reflected even in our approach to God now. And so now people are seeking a very direct link to their concept of God. And some people have taken this to the extent where they think they are equal to God. But there is a larger and more powerful motion to the reality that any thinking person senses, and yet less people are identifying that with the authoritarian or judgmental God than ever before. So the direct energy relationship to God is much more in keeping with the current evolution, the network or web work that's developed in the human species consciousness and the way that we are in groups now. We have seen the blossoming of the importance of the individual, particularly in your country and to some extent all over the world. The idea of submitting to a higher authority is not really the current best way of thinking about our interactions with the God reality or the higher realities. It is not that we are subordinate to the greater whole. It is only that we recognize it as more enlightened, more purposeful, and greater than we are, because the sum total of the design is bigger than the individual. In other words, we are not God. We are part of God. I think that's what he's saying here. Let's wait and see what else comes. And even within this meditation, I'm experiencing a change of focus. So we'll wait and see what happens next. Yeah, even while we're waiting for the meditation to resume, as I'm listening to it, I did this meditation before there was the internet. There were computers, but this was before 1990, and it was a very different world, technologically. So I might stop this and start up again when the material starts up again. Thank you.